to Christ the Center, your weekly conversation of Reformed theology. This is episode number 747 by my account. I'm Camden Busey, and I'm in Libertyville, Illinois, recording our second podcast from the new location, but now actually in a podcast studio room, but one that's all disheveled and torn up, and we're still getting things going. So we have a bit of a rat's nest of cables around the table, but we have a wonderful episode lined up for you today, one I've been looking forward to for a long time. And it's just me here in the studio, but I have with me Dr. Dominic Aquila, who's president of New Geneva Theological Seminary. He's also served over 30 years in pastoral ministry, and he's down at Kendall Presbyterian Church near Miami, Florida, I believe. Welcome to the program, Dr. Aquila. It's good to see you.
Yeah, that's where I used to be now.
That's where you used to be.
And, actually, my last service was just an interim pastor at Covenant Reformed OPC in Fort Pierce.
This makes sense. You mentioned St. Lucie. So tell us about your current post.
My wife and I wanted to be closer to our children. We have 4 children, 13 grandchildren, and 7 great-grands. And so most of them live in the greater Southeast. So the board released me to do some work, and I came down and did an interim work with the PCA Church in Stewart, and then I did that for a year, and then this Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Fort Pierce asked me to serve them, and I've been doing that off and on for them for the last almost 4 years.
Oh, of course.
They've got a good pastor now, and he's settling in. So that part's done, and to continue, we work with the seminary and New Geneva and Colorado Springs. We have a center in Fredericksburg since 2002, and in Egypt, I just got back from Egypt for teaching there for 2 weeks.
My goodness.
Reformation history and so forth. Yeah.
Well, I need to update my file, so thanks so much for that update. We really appreciate you joining us today. I'm looking forward to this conversation, but I can't just go over the Egypt trip. I've been out of the country just twice since COVID. I hadn't been out of the country for the preceding, 15 years. But how was your experience, and what were you doing in Egypt?
Well, we've started an extension of New Geneva there in 2010. And so we go twice a year and hold classes. And we've already had in this time 6 graduation classes, almost 100 students. We started out with just a certificate program, but it kept growing as the students wanted more. We work primarily with the Presbyterian Church of Egypt and students that come from throughout the Synod. It's an interesting name for the denomination. It's called the Synod of the Nile. So that's it's nice. So we been able to bring a good, solid Reformed education there, and so we kept adding until we could offer all the way up to the Master of Divinity for some. So it depends on what the student's background is and what they're going to be doing. So there's anything from a certificate for someone who doesn't have background for completed bachelor's degree, but for all the others, most of them have either they get a master in Christian ministry or master in biblical studies, master of theology, not a master of arts in theology. Not a THM, but a master of theology, and or an MDiv. And there are different number of courses that they will take for those. And then 3 years ago now, we started a Doctor of Ministry program, since that's set up even in the States to be a professional degree for pastors and missionaries, and offered in a way that that fits the model that we already the time frame that we already had. We use a campground not too far from just outside of Alexandria. That is owned by the Presbyterian Church of Egypt, and it's really well positioned. It's right on the Mediterranean, and so we get the benefits of the beauty of looking at the sea, and and it's in an enclosed compound, so it's very protected. This time, I also had opportunity to do another ministry weekend afterwards in a church in Asut, which is down in Upper Egypt. You go down because the Nile runs south to north, and so you go up the river and in the Nile Delta. So you in this bleak desert, and all of a sudden there's this everything along the Nile is just lush and green and very fruitful and very productive. So it's an amazing thing to see that. So it's not just an oasis because it flows the whole distance of the Nile. And so we get to see
That's wonderful.
It's really, really good experience. And there's just, Egypt's easy in it to get in and out of. And we've never had any problems with any of the terrorism issues.
Yeah.
So that's been a blessing.
Yeah.
Good relationship with the churches and with students, and seeing real production. We've seen the Reformation really take hold there, and because they had forgotten their back. And so I tell them the story of, you're right here by Alexandria. Let me tell you what happened here. And their eyes get real big. I said, you realize you have Clement in Alexandria? And I said, my hero, Athanasius, he was right there fighting the battles with against Arius. And then everything along the North Africa coast, you're just a little bit away from Hippo and
Augustine.
Augustine. And then he was a Berber. The largest tribe in North Africa is the Berbers. And then you have Tertullian over it. He was a Berber also. And he, of course, was in Carthage, which is now Tunisia. Cyprian, who gave us that great quote about that apart from the church, there's ordinarily no salvation. It's even in the Confession of Faith now. And Cyprian said that in the 200s. So that's an amazing statement.
It is. Praise God. That's
so
wonderful.
I tell them all this that happened. I said, so what I'm teaching you, your fathers taught us.
Yes.
And they all, what? Where we? Because they don't have any concept of history with all this great historical place that you hear.
Well, their library burned down.
Yeah, that's right. And they've got a beautiful one in its place now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, incidentally, I read some a history book about that, examining different theories of what may have happened. So I don't know. There's one, I forget the title of the book, but I was just browsing the stacks at the public library one day and found that. It seemed to be that this author's leading theory was it was swallowed up in an earthquake, actually. So who knows? But certainly
found it in the bottom of the ocean. It's right there on the sea. You can drive and look down and see parts of it.
Wow. Well, today we're going to be speaking quite a bit about history, and we've got the right person for the job. We're going to be speaking, incidentally, about a unique topic, looking at Presbyterian publications from the 19th and the 20th centuries. And also, ideally, connecting this not only to the Presbyterian history there, but perhaps on the way, learning some lessons about things as we go. And I couldn't help but think about this. I've had this topic going through my mind, at least for the last year. And I have a copy of this book here. We're not going to necessarily go through it, page by page, but it's by Vander Velde, The Presbyterian Churches in the Federal Union, 1861 to 1869. It's a really important book on Presbyterian history, but there's an entire chapter in here just devoted to various publications or newspapers and journals that were published and distributed particularly during the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on where you live. And I couldn't help but think, I think there were 13 or 14 just at the time. And there were, vigorous, authors in their writing vigorously, I should say, and publishing prolifically back and forth. It was the place to be. And there's so much to be said about this. I couldn't help but think I need to dig into this and talk more about this and expose some of this history to other people. So that's why we have Dr. Aquila on today. And of course, Dr. Aquila, you're right in the front lines in many ways of Presbyterian news and publishing with the Aquila Report. Maybe you can provide us a little bit of an update. I'm sure most all of our listeners know about it and have visited it, perhaps even regularly. But what's the latest news? Not just that the Aquila Report is publishing, but that's about the Aquila Report.
Some of the history of it. The Aquila Report started in May of 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And it came after the end of having served as the first editor of the PCAnews.com, which started in 2000, which then morphed into the By Faith magazine and By Faith Online, which is now the denominational magazine of the PCA. So in 1993, the print version, of course, the internet really didn't exist that much in 1993, but the Presbyterian Messenger was the Messenger was the denominational magazine for the PCA, and it went belly up in 1993. And so from there until 2000, there was no denominational magazine. And in 2000, as the internet was becoming more useful people were getting computers. Of course, everything was back then was almost all dial-up,
Sure. Yeah, I know.
On the phone, when you listen. Anyway, so they said, well, maybe we should go ahead and start first a online presence, and then it can morph into something, or just had a hard copy component to it. So that was done, and they asked me to serve as the editor of that in 2000. So I was pastoring in Miami at the time at Kendall at a Presbyterian, and so I moved to Atlanta and began that, and took off pretty well. We began finding our way because it was a different model, and but I think it began to help the church coalesce around things and get news that they weren't getting, at least in the best ways between 93 to 2000. Eventually, they decided to add that hard copy component, and the name was changed. So they brought in an editor because I told them if they ever did that, you need someone who had this sense of layout, because that's a whole different skill set that you don't have to worry about on the internet. And so I stayed with the program part-time until 2007. And I tried to make it a sort of a newsy thing for people to who's doing where, who's moving where, what's going on in churches. And so when I left, they didn't continue doing that because I somewhat felt plugged into the life of the church. Mm-hmm. And so I got people asking, we're not getting the information like before. We feel lost and not knowing what's going on in the PCA. So a friend of mine who had been involved at helping to plan the idea of the PCAnews.com came to me, and he says, well, why don't we do this? It came to me the other day that we should go ahead and just start. You've got the experience, so let's do it just an internet online web magazine. And he came up with the name, actually, the Aquila Report. And of course, the big big ticket item on that time was the Drudge Report. So
of course,
where that was where the idea came from. So we started, and we didn't really know, we were sort of messing around with trying to find our niche. And it came in 2009 with the General Assembly that came at that time. We had quite a few issues. So leading up to it, we covered them, and afterward, during and after. And that began to help us to develop our identity. The intent was to be PCA, but also to have a wider focus, since we weren't a denominational magazine, we could freelance. And so that's where things really began. So 2009, 2010 is where we, I think, found our voice and our print, I guess. And so it's been the go-to magazine that covers the wider field of things that people can go to quickly. So It's been great. I've enjoyed it very much. Have staff around the country. It helps me post things. And we started out as a Drudge Report, as an aggregator, but we do have quite a few original pieces that people write for us as well. Mm-hmm. So that's basically what we do. And so it's great. Great ministry.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we're very thankful for that. And there are a lot of things people may wonder, well, if you could post, it's so easy to post stuff online. Well, a lot of times people don't have their own website, don't know where to post it, but having everything in one place is useful. But sometimes there are some things that people, you don't have any other place to put out, especially regarding some judicial matters where people want desperately to know what's going on, and there aren't channels for that sort of thing. And that's just one aspect or one place within the publication field where you are providing a wonderful service, being able to expose and share voices and sides of matters that aren't necessarily easily shared otherwise. So we're thankful for that, and that you have that opportunity. So check out the Aquila Report online. You'll find it quite easily. We'll have links to it in the episode description. That leads us to the question, because things are so easy now with the internet to proliferate, and with social media and blogs and everything, that it's, people can get their voice out there in various ways. But in some regards, we've kind of lost something from the 19th and 20th century with all these newspapers and the editing and whatnot. I'd love to go back to that time, and maybe if you can share with us some of the history and some of the higher points of Presbyterian publications of those eras, we might be able to learn a few things and then connect some dots.
Yeah, let me if I could just start Please. Back a little bit to show you more recent importance of church magazines.
Yeah.
Some of them were started by individuals, others by churches. So just as we go back recently, the PCA was probably helped in one way to be founded because of the denominational magazine for the Southern Presbyterian Church, the old Presbyterian Church US.
Yeah.
There was PCUS and then the Presbyterian Church USA. And it was called the Presbyterian Survey. In 1963, and it was printed out of Richmond. That was the headquarters for it because it was close to nearby to Richmond, to Union Seminary there. There was an article that was entitled, or it was actually a series of articles entitled, "Do We Need an Infallible Bible?" Now, this is 1963. And there are 4 denominational seminaries, Louisville, Kentucky, and Union and Richmond, the Columbia Seminary in Decatur, just outside of Atlanta, and an Austin Seminary. So the editor asked the 4 professors of systematic theology of each of those seminaries to write an article answering that question: do we need an infallible Bible? And they all answered no. They wrote their article. So that really, I mean, that's 10 years before the PCA started. Now, it was already known that there was some debates going on in the Southern Presbyterian Church, the PCUS, about these matters. And so that sort of helped to crystallize some things. And basically, it was also out of that the president of French Camp Academy in French Camp, Mississippi, Sam Patterson, read that article, and he, very prominent in Mississippi, was a preacher, great evangelist, a good preacher, and great administrator. He read that and realized that things were more serious than he was led on to be, because he was in a very conservative Bible-believing area. So now it comes out in this way, and that's what led to the founding of Reformed Seminary. That he read that article and went down to Jackson from French Camp and spoke to them. So you could see the impact, both positive and negatively, of magazines.
Certainly. I grew up in the Presbyterian Church USA in Illinois, but as far as the denomination goes, I grew up in a very conservative local church. Other than being egalitarian, the pastor was a 5-point Calvinist, and the church, it's hard to understand from the outside, but the idea is, well, we'll stay as long as no one kicks us out, and we'll withhold all of our givings from the Presbyterian, from the denomination. I don't approve of that mentality because it's not really functionally Presbyterian, but that's how things were. But the publications had a role there too, because there was a publication called the Presbyterian Layman, perhaps you know, which was for the PCUSA, I think, an independent but a little bit more conservative-minded publication that was always seeking to share the news and the goings-on of the denomination in a way that was accessible to and from the standpoint of a more conservative side of the mainline church.
In fact, the comparable magazine to the Presbyterian Layman was Concerned Presbyterians, and that was a lay-run magazine, so that the ruling elders basically took charge of that, and so they were one of the founding pillars of what would become the PCA, and keeping everybody informed about it.
Yeah.
So it was a startup on that. You think about the Presbyterian Journal was also started about 1946, along with and it was originally called the Southern Presbyterian Journal. Was its first head. It was the first edition. The first number was actually printed on one of those blue spirit machines that you can get high just spinning.
Like a mimeograph?
Yeah, well, it was in before mimeograph.
Even before that.
Yeah, that's right. That one that it was called the spirit.
You can huff your paper.
That's right. It was blue and your fingers got blue. And it was done at the basement of the First Presbyterian Church in Weaverville, North Carolina.
Oh, wow.
And so they put those things together, stapled them and sent them out to friends and people. And so that was the action that they did there. So that helped also. So, we're just sort of working back now. And the other one, if you think about it, was the original Christianity Today.
Yes. Samuel Craig.
People aren't aware of that. From 1930 to about 1938, the Christianity Today, which was basically a basic broad evangelical, but it was a lot of the OPC individuals were part of that.
And pre-OPC guys. Yeah.
Yep. And then they went after that to an occasional issue. So by 38, they just didn't have enough wherewithal to be able to keep it going on a monthly basis. And so they finally, by 1949, they closed it up. And then it was that title they wanted, so that when the group wanted to start the broader evangelical thing, they had Billy Graham involved, and L. Nelson Bell and Marcellus Kick and so forth. They actually started they asked permission to use the name, and they were given that permission, and it was very involved. So you've got the first thing, the publication of the Reformed Presbyterian Reformed book publishers with Samuel Craig was the Christian. They actually printed the early copies of the Christianity Today, and in 1955, 56 in that area.
Wow.
And Marcellus Kick was involved, one of its editors, and also Samuel Craig was editor as well as publisher in those earlier days. So the involvement of Presbyterians in printing is, that's a sort of a theme here, goes back even to that. There was, of course, the original The Guardian, which was the magazine of the original magazine of the OPC, which is now the New Horizons. So that kept the church, in place and contact. So
The Guardian was actually started out of an interesting conundrum, because Daryl Hart has a chapter on this history of The Guardian in the OPC's history book. I believe it's Between the Times. His chapter is in the book Between the Times. What happened was there were many of the Westminster faculty who were writing in Christianity Today, the Samuel Craig version, in the early 30s and mid-30s, and they had formed what was called the Presbyterian Constitutional Covenant Union, which was basically an affinity group that was preparing to begin, if necessary, preparing to begin a new church, which would be the OPC. If reform within the church failed, then they were going to covenant to start a new church. And so what happened was there were a lot of people on the board. Most of the board at Westminster were favorable, obviously, towards a new seminary, that is Westminster, as opposed to Princeton. But they were not yet favorable of a new church. They were thinking it was too soon. It wasn't that they were principally opposed to a new church ever beginning, but they thought it was too soon and that they needed to do more work. And so this led to an impasse where the faculty at Westminster basically issued an ultimatum to the board and said, you need to get, with the program regarding the Presbyterian Constitutional Covenant Union, and if not, we're all going to resign. And so the board resigned. They got effectively a new board, but now that meant they didn't have a mouthpiece. They didn't have Machen and the other faculty at Westminster didn't have anywhere that they could really publish, even though they remained friends with Samuel Craig, and some of them would write pieces in CT. They couldn't write the pieces calling for a new church and regarding a new church. And that's where The Guardian came from. It's wild. And all the issues of The Guardian are available online. You can find them at opc.org. And I think most of, if not all, soon to be all of the issues of the old CT will be available through the Presbyterian Historical Society, the PCA Historical Society. Wayne Sparkman has them all. We just mailed some extras that we had that I think completed their set. So hopefully in the next year or two, those will be scanned and uploaded to the website as well.
By the way, there's another interesting factoid is Machen contributed some of his wealth towards the starting of
he did.
Printing. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, it wouldn't have been really possible without that. There were some really important editors, Stonehouse being one of them, Leslie Sloat and others involved in those early issues. But I think that was 35 or 38 in that ballpark.
Before Machen died.
It was 35, I think, was the first issues of the Presbyterian Guardian, and obviously then Machen died. They had a memorial issue and whatnot. But So there's a long history, just back to the 30s.
Just if you
but
keep
it still
going
goes
back.
on.
And then just one other to throw in there at the very beginning. Of course, we have the Christian Century, which was a liberal magazine. It did have Presbyterians involved as well as others that were trying to have a sort of the federal union of churches, the prelude to the World Council and the National Council of Churches. It was called the Federal Union. But anyway, everything was hyped. It was sort of a post-millenarianism within the liberal branch. They saw the life-changing, life inventions, things were just moving along. So they said, for sure, the 20th century will be the Christian century. And so in 1900, they, with all that optimism, started the Christian century. And it became the main voice of more liberal, social, gospel-based oriented Christianity in the country for the longest time. It still exists, but it's much a shadow of itself anymore. Still published out of Chicago as well.
They didn't update it to the Christian Millennium back in the turn.
They've left it.
They lost a good marketing opportunity here to upgrade.
Right. They could. It was probably Y2K-ish.
Yeah, exactly. Different kind of Y2K.
Going back now, we go back further. It goes back to, let's say, to February of 1831. There was the Presbyterian, which was a newspaper magazine issued out of Philadelphia. Almost everything came out of Philadelphia. It was Philadelphia or Richmond or New York. Those were the major cities to do this. Was supported by Williams Martine, and continued well into the 20th century, but then it lost, it fell out of favor. Nobody else was supporting it. So that's an early one. It goes all the way back to 831. So the Van der Velde book starts with 1860 and goes to I think, right. And so forth. The Southern Presbyterian Review began as founded in but it was unable to get works published. It was founded because the Princeton magazines or journals wouldn't publish their articles. And this is way before the war. But so it ran from about 1847 to 1885.
Wow, that's a good stretch.
It did, though, it turned over eventually to James Woodrow, who was believed in evolution. So he had the idea of God.
Oh, like a theological evolutionist,
right? Yeah, theologically. So he was put on trial for that and was acquitted. He rescued the journal and kept it going, but in strong opposition to his views, subscriptions then dropped off. So it sort of followed that model. If you get woke, you go broke. And so eventually that happened. Then there was a new journal that came in its place called the Quarterly, Presbyterian Quarterly, which began 1887. And it was issued out of Richmond, Virginia, and it ran to about 1904. So it didn't have a long history, but it was there. So my sense is, you gather traction and then somehow that traction gets lost. Another Southern Presbyterian publication was the Presbyterian Critic and Monthly Review. Mm-hmm. It was issued out of Baltimore. Also, you have quite a few. Baltimore was quite a center for Presbyterianism, so you did have quite a bit of support there by Stuart Robinson and Thomas Peck. They were editors, and this journal began around 1855 and ended in 1856, so it didn't last that long.
Well, Robertson was involved in several. I'm sure they're on your list here.
Yes, he was. The Presbyterian Quarterly Review and New School was a New School publication. So remember, the New School started in the 1837, came out of the breach that took place at that General Assembly. That's when Hodge and Thornwell put their powers together, I guess, and basically kicked out the union, because remember in 1801 there was that union, not merger, between the Congregationalist and the Presbyterian Church,
the plan of union,
and then so finally they were able to end that union at the General Assembly in 1937. So the the New School folks left and they started their publication in there. So it was quarterly review, that Presbyterian Quarterly Review at that point, but it was short-lived. Probably ran for volume maybe maybe 10 years. Succeeding this was the American Theological Review and the American Presbyterian and Theological Review. There was actually a merger. So it started off as the American Theological Review. They added the word Presbyterian later on. Mm-hmm. The old school counterpart to the Quarterly Review was the Presbyterian magazine. So the old school wouldn't be left out. So also published in Philly with Mitchell, W.M. Mitchell as publisher, and Cortland Van Rensselaer as serving as editor. The journal ran from about 1851 through September of 1860. Now, I'm thinking that since that was an old school thing, that some of the war probably brought it to an end in September of 1860.
Because they merged old and new schools, North and South merged.
Yeah. And at that point, but just even the
war itself. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And everything that was leading up to it. So we can see there was a lot of attention. And, it would take a lot of time to set type and everything.
Oh, sure.
Back in those days, that was different than what we wanted. Going back to the Princeton, apparently they had a number of different publications. They had different titles that ran for a number of years, then they would change. They start out with the Biblical Repertory, 1825 to 1829, and then beginning in 1830, it was the Biblical Repertoire and Theological Review.
Right.
Okay. And then they changed it to the Biblical Repertoire and Princeton Review. Mm-hmm. And that lasted all the way through 1871 that way. And then they changed it to Presbyterian Quarterly and Princeton Review. Anyway, the list goes on to all the way through 1929, which was just the Princeton Theological Review was the final.
Are you aware of whether they had any editorial philosophical changes there or format changes, or were they just changing the title for whatever reason?
They were changing the title. I went online because I found a place that University of Wisconsin, interestingly, great digital copies of all these that I just mentioned.
Interesting.
And so there's stuff there. Anyone who's interested in doing some Warfield stuff, they'll probably find stuff they didn't know existed. Huh. And not only he, but also others as well. So I can send you the title, the website, and they're beautiful digital reproductions.
Yeah.
So, and they're easily accessible. And so I was looking all this up, when you asked me to do this, and I got caught up in reading all this stuff.
Isn't that the most fun? The research, you find all this interesting stuff.
And they were, the thing is, I was thinking, they were writing everything by hand. They didn't have typewriters. They didn't have computers. Yeah. I don't think we have enough trouble reading everything that even Calvin or Luther wrote back in their day.
No.
Imagine if they had a word process like we do, that's it. We'd never finish.
Well, Neil Postman might have something to say about that. Having all this technology is changing our minds and our epistemology. So maybe they wouldn't have been able to produce as much because their minds would have been altered.
Oh, man, they can write. And I was thinking you take that quill and you have to get the nib down right, dip it in the ink, and you get the scratchy paper.
Yes.
But
that makes you think. I'm not an advocate for this. I write by hand once in a while, but if you're using a dip pen, you're just forced to think about what you're going to say. Nowadays, students will let's just put it on the Word doc. Right. We'll figure it out later.
That's right, because you can't erase it, or you could scratch through, but then they don't.
It's very annoying.
Look very good.
Right.
So, but the Princeton Theological Seminary Review, whatever term title it had, was the dominant and the longest running from about 1825 to 1929. So that's 104 years. Different names, different authors, and but they're the most constant.
I wonder how much. Surely there's a dissertation here for somebody if it hasn't been written already. But it'd be interesting to see just Princeton's. It was founded in 1812 and just a long-running seminary, but for the longest time it was the voice of conservative Presbyterianism leading up to the Civil War, and then through it, it was still that voice in the North. But it'd be interesting to know the degree to which the journal, had in terms of cementing that reputation or that position, and then moving it forward. The interaction between a seminary and its publication, it's interesting to me how much of it is unidirectional, but how much might be bidirectional. They reinforce one another.
That's right. And by the way, the other thing that impressed me about just reading through the table of contents.
Yeah.
It went on and on. They had people writing from everywhere. And they were writing, like in their reviews, book reviews, for instance, were just gorgeous in terms of how they interacted. It wasn't just, this is my nice thing. He has a beautiful wife. His kids love him, and his dog licks his face when he comes home. They've challenged each other. And I'm thinking in our generation, we have this cancel culture framework that you say something that this me, I'm a sensitive thing and I need my space, and we worry about all that kind of thing.
Snowflakes.
You make a criticism, you violated the 9th commandment, and everybody gets all shook up. And these guys they took it as part of they wrote that way, not because they were trying to tear someone down, but they were dealing with the realm of ideas, and we just don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
That's another takeaway I had as I was reading through those.
Well, the things that are written of Stuart Robinson, who I'm a great admirer of and a fan of, but Vandervelde has some choice statements about Robinson. He's no fan. Like he casts Robinson not as the nicest of guys, but and there's one passage, I'd have to look it up. I don't have it on at my fingertips at the moment, but he just speaks about his journal being just this outlet for his bile. He just lets it out. But they wrote strongly, and they definitely shared their mind, and they shared their thoughts about opposing views, and they didn't hold back.
That's correct. And by the way, you can also put someone like that, like Dabney, in that category. They said he was a very difficult person to work with. In fact, when he left Richmond because things weren't going his way, and he's the one that actually founded what today is Washington and Lee as Liberty Hall, and then he got messed up with them and fell apart. So he went down to just outside of Knoxville, and he started what now the University of Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And then he left there and went to Austin and started Austin College and with a seminary. So the guy could start things. He just couldn't get along with people along the way. So.
What would have been the typical practice, or what's your sense of how many of these newspapers people were reading? Are they subscribing, getting them sent to their home? How did that even work? Because I imagine some of distribution might have been a challenge for a lot of locations as well.
Yeah, because most of it would go through the mail,
sure.
And your mail system was very slow. Definitely by horseback, mule, and so forth, train to different places. So along at least the eastern seaboard, you would have the train because it was already in place, but it would still take a while for things to get to you. But just think, most of the people who are the readers weren't listening to radio or television.
Of course.
They had the evenings and daytime to do that reading, which we don't. So you give an executive summary and the guy's eyes are glazing over now,
Right. Can't take it.
No,
TLDR.
Sorry. So it's not an easy thing. So anyway, so I mentioned this, the Presbyterian Quarterly Review, which was the new school publication, and we go on. The old school part was Quarterly Review, but it just lasted went from 9 years, from
9 or 10 years,
1860. Right. Yeah, then the Reformed Presbyterian Church, don't leave out the General Synod, which became later on the Reformed Presbyterian Church Evangelical Church. That's merged with the original EPC, which had left the OPC in 1937 and became Bible Presbyterian. And then because they broke up again because of Carl McIntyre in 1955 in Columbus, Ohio, then so for 5 years there was the Bible Presbyterian Church Collingwood Synod, which was McIntyre's group, and then the Bible Presbyterian Church, which had broken off from the OPC in 37.
Yes.
So in 61, they changed their name to Evangelical Presbyterian Church to get away from being always
the BPs.
bothered with. I always have to explain McIntyre, and not only kept that from 61 to 64, and that's when they merged with the Presbyterian Church, Reformed Presbyterian Church General Synod. I think, if my memory serves, there were only like about 9 or 10 congregations left, and so that was a sort of convenient merger for the EPC. That EPC. The second one, of course, starts in 1981,
right?
With the big steeple churches coming out of a lot of the Caseman case out of Potomac Presbytery of the Northern Church, and so they started the synod. They remember in 1833 there was a break off between the old lights and the new lights, and the question was, can members vote in civil affairs? Because the old Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America, which is the old synod, the old lights, believed that we can't do that. We shouldn't vote because the country has not adopted the reality that Jesus is Lord, and it's not in the Constitution. So we should engage and involve ourselves in that kind of thing. So the General Synod also didn't want to continue just singing psalms, because now the I guess what we call it, the happy clappy of the day sort of was coming in. So they wanted to sort of mix it up with a few hymns as well as psalms. So they started the Reformed Presbyterian Advocate, which went from actually from 1867 all the way to 1965. And they only stopped, notice that date, 65. That's when the year after they joined with the old the EPC. So that they closed that down, and they had their own magazine. And then the Reformed, so that was the Advocate. The Banner of Covenant, of the Covenant rather, was run also by the Board of Missions of the old Reformed Presbyterian Church General Synod. That ran from about 1860 and to not too long. It didn't last that long. But somewhere, though, the Presbyterian Church in North America, which are the Covenanters, they started a publication that went from 1845 to 1862. So they were mostly in the northern climes. Of course, they have their seminary in Pittsburgh, and their college, Geneva College in Beaver Falls. On the Presbyterian newspapers, the Christian Observer started in Amasa Converse was the editor. His dates were 1795 to 1872. This became one of the longest published magazines, and it was the Christian Observer. So it was maintained into the 20th century, when it was really failing, and was picked up by Edwin Elliott. He bought the rights to it, and he kept it going. And then then when he died, the print edition was concluded around 2007, and it's now picked. They still have a semblance of it going with Bob Williams, who is in the PCA, serving in a church in Lexington as a business manager for the church, and it's all digital form. Wow. But it was basically a lot of devotional. The other thing the Observer did was to really focus on the catechism and encouraging the members, especially parents, to encourage their children to learn the shorter catechism, and they learn, and the older folks to as originally intended, the larger catechism, which was intended that was its original purpose. So that was interesting. So that probably in terms of just history, so give it up to 2007. So from middle of the 19th century all the way through the middle of the 20 into the beginning of the 21st. So it, in terms of just publication, it probably had the longest run history without the name changing at all.
Wow.
Let's see. There was the Christian Observer. Then I meant there was the Charleston Observer. So it was another important Presbyterian newspaper issued around 1827 to about 1845. So it came along. And then in the South, there was the Central Presbyterian. It was published in Richmond. Moses Hogue, who taught at Union, and Thomas Moore were editors, and it ran from 1856 to 1908. So that probably mentioned in Vandervelde's book because it covers, it's in that period of time. And that later merged with the Southwestern Presbyterian. So the Central Presbyterian merged with the Southwestern Presbyterian. That's the name they took. And then the Southern Presbyterian later on to form the Presbyterian of the South. So it went through a number of changes from Central Presbyterian to Southwestern Presbyterian, then to Southern Presbyterian, and then eventually they merged all together to form the Presbyterian of the South. Wow. And that was had its long. So it went through about 1908.
My goodness. Most of these I do see in Vandervelde, just old school publications during the war or leading up to. They're founded, the Biblical Repertory and Princeton Review founded in 1825, but many of the others founded 31, 41, 61, 57, 61, 62.
That's that list that I gave you. Right?
Exactly. They're all over the place. It's interesting.
They're all the same. It's just they changed the name.
No trouble. Yeah, but it's interesting to see most of them are weekly, not just quarterly. The Princeton's and the Danville Quarterly Review were quarterly, and they were $3 in 1861 for the year. And the other ones are weeklies, ranging from $1.50 to $2.50 for a subscription price. Things have changed.
Inflation for you.
It sure is.
That's right. That's right. And by the way, that's like I said, as I just rummaged through all those numbers, I was getting caught up in it.
Yeah.
To the point where I was going to be sucked into that
the vortex of curiosity.
And and I was just impressed at how much they published. Mm-hmm. It was amazing. So I could see they kept typesetters in business for a long time.
They must have.
Yeah. Another Southern publication was the Presbyterian Critic and Monthly Review, and it came out of Baltimore with your friend Stuart Robinson. Notice that I noticed now in light of what you said, it's the Presbyterian Critic.
Yeah, suitable.
So, that's right. And I'm wondering how many did it. And Thomas Peck also worked in, so he also was a Southern writer, theologian that wrote, and he worked in that publication. The Presbyterian Quarterly Review was a new school publication, came out of Philadelphia. Let's see, it didn't really last, it was about 10 years, from 1852 to about 1862. Then the American Theological Review and the American Presbyterian and Theological Review, they merged eventually. They came out later on from the same people. Benjamin Wallace was sort of the editor of that. So, I don't know why these things would die and they changed the name, but same people are doing the editing on it. The old school counterpart was the Quarterly Review. And in the Presbyterian would have been the Presbyterian magazine. The old school's Quarterly Review was the Presbyterian magazine. That's what they called it. And also published in Philadelphia. W.M. Mitchell was the publisher. Okay, and let's see. I think I already had mentioned that. So I think that's where we come down to the New York Observer was also a school publication, published only from 1829, 1912. So it lasted quite a distance. So those are your list that I was able to find.
Wow.
Vandervelde House holds a whole bunch of others.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, one that there's the Danville Review, if that hasn't been mentioned already, and then another that I believe Robinson was involved in called True Presbyterian. You got to love when people stake that claim, and what they name their publication tells you a lot about what they think. There
were others that, because of the way I guess I was doing my search for this, that but through other sources, that almost every synod in at least in the South, usually had their own paper.
Yeah.
Some sort. And
the synods did.
Right. Huh?
Synods had their own paper.
Synods,
interesting.
yeah, because they had synods back in those days. And yeah, that was a big thing. So, and because Thornwell's view was that each presbytery should work to have local schools, day schools, if you would, Christian schools, because they didn't have the public school system at the time. Then you would have number of presbyteries that get together, not necessarily synod, that they would then start a regional college. So if you look throughout the whole South, you'll find all of these Presbyterian schools that was based on this principle. Really? That a number of them would do that. Then a number of synods would get together and start a seminary. So you have Kentucky,
sure.
Richmond, Virginia. Of course, Columbia started in Columbia, South Carolina, but it was the Synod of South Carolina and Georgia and Florida that oversaw that one. And then Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana had Austin.
Yeah. Hmm. Really?
But you had these colleges that just in almost every area that when I went to Belhaven, what's now university, and it was originally started in 1883, and it started out as a woman's synodical seminary. Then seminary was a college and training, or a training school. Where seminary, training, and eventually, so it remained a girls' school until 1954. But it was owned and operated by the Synod of Mississippi of the Southern Presbyterian Church.
Wow. Mm-hmm. So what would we say about these publications of the past and connecting them now a bit, or at least this practice, to publishing today? How do you think, obviously there are a lot of surface things we could say, but I think more at a theological or philosophical or maybe even ecclesiological level, how have things changed, and has anything been lost? Are things better? Are things worse? What do you think?
I think the move to the digital has lost a sense of tactile.
Sure.
So that's the reason newspapers and magazines, hard copies of those are dying off. Mm-hmm. And that was happening even before the full rage of digital came. But that when the digital came, it's, you hardly get a newspaper more, because you could just, you have your handheld device, you can punch in the New York Times, Washington Post, whatever you want to go and read. You can get it quickly. It's summarized for you. Everything is detailed. So, like I think you pointed out that in our reading style, it has probably changed our whole brain operation in terms of how we just sit still long enough, get a good light, have a nice easy chair, good light, so it reflects nicely on the paper, and read. I think that has changed a great deal. And I think then that affects our ability to really think through concepts. So whether you're dealing with something as always different, no matter who you are, as the Trinity, or whether or not you, or something like, how do you put the the theological concepts of just justification, adoption, sure, sanctification, how they interact. We just don't sit there long enough to think about it.
Mm-hmm. My goodness. Yeah, and at the fast-paced nature of things as well seems to mitigate against reflection, thoughtful discourse. It's almost as if you're sometimes, at least in discourse, that you're just playing tag. Somebody throws something out, then if you get the response you just want to get it out there as fast as you can so you have the last word. And that's not always helpful either.
Oh, that we published a list that someone else did of on the Aquila Report of the some statements that pastoral search committees asked potential candidates. And
Sure.
One of them was, the last pastor preached for 18 minutes. Can you beat that?
Oh, man.
I mean, some back in Jonathan Edwards' day, that the introduction, if it was only 18 minutes, then that was a slow day.
Oh, wow.
And so our whole orientation is so different in terms of just paying attention and capturing things. Yeah.
My goodness. Well, this has been a really fun conversation. This is something we can go back and reference and appreciate your research in sharing this with us, that we have such a record of all these different Presbyterian publications. But I love how we've gotten all the way back up to the present day. And just, of course, we want to remind people about the Aquila Report and the wonderful work that you're doing there, the important service you're providing to the church. And there's a lot going on, and certainly podcasts are one way that some news and information can come out. And you have a podcast as well, do you not?
That's right. The
tell us
Aquila
about that.
Report and Weekly Review. And so you can just go to any major, we're listed on all the major podcast sites. So.
We'll certainly have links to all those resources available for people to follow up, and as well as to the book and perhaps even some of these archives. Maybe we'll find that one at the University of Wisconsin. The Badgers are holding all the Princeton digital archives. Who knew?
I don't know why they had somebody up there really collected.
Somebody up there, yeah, was
that's right.
a true
and they're
Presbyterian.
all beautifully digitalized. Yeah,
wow,
that's nice.
That's great. Well, Dr. Aquila, thanks so much for joining me today. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I know we got to meet in person at PCA-GA. I'm hoping to connect with you again sometime.
Good. Thank you.
And I appreciate that. We look forward to following up with other folks as well. And if anyone has any questions, you can write on in to mail@reformedforum.org. We'll do our best to follow up, and look forward to news and updates that are coming from us. There's many changes going on here at Reformed Forum for the better, I think, and moving to this new location, we're getting things up to speed. So you'll see things in the videos that are improving, and also in our future courses that we have and produce online through our website, our online learning platform, Reformed Academy. You'll see a set and design change. So we're excited about all that. But I do, at the end, want to thank everybody for listening, and we hope you join us again next time on Christ the Center.